welcome to our symposium of labor love and homecoming towards a trans-Asian and global culture sisterhood. I'm Dr. Ying Xia, Associate Professor of Chinese Studies and Film and Media Studies at UF. I'm very honored and very privileged to have this chance to moderate the symposium, to tie everything together. And thank you everyone for coming during the lunchtime to join this hopefully very delectable discussion. I'm very hungry too because I just came all the way from my teaching. And I also want to say hi to our audience online because we are doing a live streaming event. Thank you for your support hugely and anonymously. Thank you. First of all, I want to mention first and foremost our organizers and sponsorship. The symposium is co-sponsored by UF Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research, UF Center for International Studies, and the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies. We have a beautiful name. It's called SONGS, S-O-N-G-S initiative. Thank you so much for your support to make this happen. I also do want to thank Will Hasty, my colleague, and the main co-organizer and main person for this event, our hero behind the curtain. Thank you so much for all your hard work and effort to make everything possible. We are very, very grateful. Thank you indeed. Shall we give a big applause to Professor Hasty? Thank you. So I'd like to begin today's event with a brief introduction of our honored guest speaker, Professor Zhang from New York University. So Dr. Zhang is Associate Professor of Cinema Studies and the Founding Director for the Asian Film and Media Initiative at New York University. Her main areas of scholarly interest include Chinese language film history in its culture, aesthetic, political, and gendered manifestations, within the broad frameworks of modernity, modernism, and cosmopolitanism. Her main scholarly books include an amorous history of the silver screen Shanghai cinema from 1896 to 1937, published in 2005, and 2 edited volumes, The Urban Generation, Chinese Cinema and Society at the Turn of the 21st Century, published in 2007. And these are the 2 books she has published before, and I use them for my teaching and research. So they are my main source of inspirations for me as well as for my students. So feel free to pass this around. And another edited volume she has published is called DV-Made China, Digital Subjects and Social Transformations After Independent Film, published in 2015. And I also use that book volume for my course taught before. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy today because I'm actually using that as a major reference for the course I will be co-teaching with Dr. Churchill Roberts next fall, called Documentary, Media, and Society. I have the flyer for the course. I'm going to take this venue as an opportunity to publicize our course. And Dr. Churchill Roberts can talk more about it, okay? So I would say I'm very, very fortunate to be able to introduce Zhen, because we have so many things so much intertwined with each other, scholarly and personally. And I really want to say that aside from her academic interests, she's also a wonderful poet, curator, producer, and a wonderful mother. So I believe her personal and intellectual examination at the so-called motherhood and sisterhood would inform a very important arc of today's talk titled Women Make Waves in Sinophone Cinemas. Before we go to Zhen's talk, I just want to give you guys some heads up about the timeline for today's event. So Dr. Zhen's presentation will be 40 to 50 minutes long, and the talk will be followed by an interdisciplinary panel discussion and Q&A with the audience, including Professor Will Hasty from Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, Aida Hozek from Political Science, Barbara Monell, Rossman Chair and Director of the Center for the Humanities and Public Affairs, and Chicha Roberts from Media Production, Management, and Technology, and Wilson Chomera, Associate Director of the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Zhen again for this wonderful talk. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to remove the mask since I'm quite far from everybody in this huge auditorium, conference room. Thank you so much to the songs. I love the acronym. It's also perfect for the talk, for the film. It's full of songs, literally. And yeah, the individuals involved, in particular, Professor Hasty and Xiaoying and other colleagues who were at the film screening last night and now again here joining a conversation. I feel very honored and privileged. I think, a talk is one thing, but having other people conversing with you and sharing their work just makes academic scholarly work all the more meaningful and constructive. So I hope to actually speak less, especially because many of you have seen the film yesterday. So I'll try to maybe stay on course with the time I have. I will actually, in the first part of the talk, to give you a bit larger context of this film or this chapter or this article some of you have read, which is a part of a larger book project titled Women Make Waves in Sinophone Cinemas. So I get a chance also to workshop some of the broader general ideas of the book in which Jasmine Lee's film and work is situated. So let's move on this PowerPoint slide. Yes, okay. I'm not going to read my introduction and the chapter and just try to talk through these slides in a more colloquial conversational fashion. I'm sure sometimes it will go smoothly, sometimes I get probably into some glitches, try to connect the threads. So just a quick sort of historical glimpse here. The book covers mostly the period, I would say, globalization, neoliberal era from the 80s to more recent sort of years, pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. The epilogue actually ends right now here. So it is in the introduction I try to give a brief historical summary and literature reviews and such to situate the project. So just an example of women's role in Sinophone Chinese language film history. I'll use these two terms interchangeably, and I'm not going to elaborate in great detail their overlap or difference, but the book has more to say about the choices of these quite contentious terms within the Chinese area studies. So Wang Hanlun, whom I wrote about at some length in the beginning of the amorous history of Shanghai cinema book, women were just entering into the public sphere as audiences, as a workforce, and very few embraced, with a lot of courage, this entertainment, mass media entertainment industry, because it was not considered a respectable trade for women to just show their bodies and beauties and so on. They should be at home serving their fathers and husbands and brothers and such and sons, right? But she was among the few brave ones who became a film actress. She was a divorcee, and she became a kind of professional working woman in Shanghai, moved from the surrounding area to Shanghai, and joining this ferment of Shanghai as a cosmopolitan culture center in the region. So she played in many early films, melodrama films in particular. My chapter talks a lot about melodrama, so I want to give you, kind of back flash picture quickly. Many of these films are lost. We can only, study them through print sources and photographs and so on. So anyway, she performed in a lot of films, strong and weak, all combined, and became kind of the face, for Chinese modernity, society in transformation from the old to new. And most importantly, she had a pair of so-called civilized feet, meaning bound feet being unbound. And I made a great deal about that story in my conception of vernacular modernism, the turn to vernacular literature, to secular modern culture, and how women's feet, body, embody the pain and liberation at the same time of that huge momentous transformation. But she later retired from the silver screen and became a producer, editor behind the camera, and made a film on her own with her resources, also operating a beauty salon as sort of a revenue stream. And she had this wonderful saying I just want to share with you. Every time I teach Chinese film, I start this point. I want to seek a path, do something great, gain some glory for us women. So very simple, grounded feminism, vernacular feminism, yeah, just another example in sort of early decades of film history. And we have also this Esther Ng, more recently rediscovered pioneer of Chinese language cinema, or Asian American cinema for that matter, because she operated mostly from Northern California, San Francisco, going back and forth between Hong Kong and the West Coast, making films and distributing films. And even worked in Hollywood, with a couple of her projects. And she was a very, also very, I wouldn't say sort of coming out of the closet, the concept didn't exist then, but she was very unabashedly queer, lesbian. She had partners, who played in her films. Anyway, for her story, Go for Golden Gate Girls, that wonderful documentary with a lot of footage and archival material. So these are the forerunners of the many women filmmakers that I'm talking about in my book, from the 80s and so on. So film makers, women filmmakers behind the camera were few, but they were there, and many scholars have been trying to construct the genealogy of these forerunners, pioneers, and so to speak, and how they really became path breakers for future women generations that, especially in the 80s, flourished across the Taiwan Strait, and also now, more so also among Asian Chinese American. There's a whole new wave going on. Okay, so I already mentioned quite a bit of these backgrounds, and mostly my project is situated in the post-Cold War era, 70s onwards, when although Taiwan, was kicked out of the United Nations, but it became a fast modernizing, tiger economy in the region, and gaining very consequential place in Asian economic, cultural, social sphere, but also global economy as a quasi-nation state. And this is also, in some ways, part of larger trans-Asian flow stories, even though most of my protagonists are Chinese women filmmakers from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China, but their linkages extend to broader Asian areas, as you saw in the film, the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries, and other continents, the reference to Australia and the USA, so very much a diasporic, but also distinctively regional. I try to refrain from the transnational and global kind of nomenclatures that are being popular, but they seem to be just so general and vague, and a lot of times unspecific, unlocalized. So Trans-Asia has become an important critical method for formally area studies people in sort of Asian studies. But I think the Trans-Asian also extends to the diaspora, hence it has global resonances. Now, the 70s, when Hong Kong saw the birth of new wave cinemas, and in the early 80s, the Taiwan new wave cinemas, which produced the wonderful authors like Edward Young, He Xiaoxian, and later Cai Mingliang and Ang Li. And in mainland, the fifth generation, Zhang Yimou, Chen Kaige, and the sixth generation later was Jia Zhangke, and what I call the urban generation, the volumes being circulated. All of these were great, new waves in the region, but the well-known authors, the international and domestic representations of these new waves, and by and large, and still very male-centered, very masculine, sort of modernist, sort of aesthetic, art house-oriented. So I wanted to make an intervention here. I mean, other colleagues have done so, for years too. But I tried to put together a monograph to sort of make it a more systematic intervention, conversation, not to discredit the male authors, but to highlight the gendered nature of authorship and the women's authorship in particular. And then borrow the name of Taiwan Taiwan Women's Visual Arts Festival, founded in 1993, but later changed the name to Women Make Waves, or here's a typo, Women Make Waves International Film Festival. I think that name just makes great sense for my project. They are also new wave makers and shapers, and alongside the sort of the mainstream new waves, but also they are also creating their own mainstream and currents regionally and globally. And it also concerns the cross-strait in the independent cinema network that were quite sort of kind of robust between 2001 when China entered the WTO, and about a few years ago when the thing was sort of closing down in Xi Jinping's regime, and the onset of some sort of new Cold War climate as we see now, okay? So, yeah, as I mentioned, these new wave guys, literally, and at the very bottom, we have Ning Ying, one of the few women filmmakers included in the sixth generation. She studied in Italy, worked with Bertolucci. So, yeah, very much 光头党, okay? The poster on the above is Taiwan New Cinema, the main players, although there were many important women screenwriters and directors and so on, but they just disappear in these discourses. And the international film festivals in the West have to bear a lot of responsibilities in canceling out women's presences. They just adopt one or two male authors, Zhang, Chen Kaige or Jia Zhangke, and they stick with them for decades until another guy comes in, Okay, so I just get very tired of teaching about this year after year, decade after year, and we need a new curriculum, hence we need a new book and such, and new distribution of audiovisual materials. Right, so this is one of the editions of the Women Make Waves Film Festival, and you can Google it. It's still very robust. It runs every fall, and it's not just Chinese language cinema. It's international, and just fostered over decades since 1903. out of a small office studio, and they have grown into one of the most important women festivals in the world, showing Latin American filmmakers, East Asian, East European, European and American ones. And many of the filmmakers I talk about in my book, they have all sort of availed this platform to showcase their films and share with their sisters from around the world. And I curated a series of mainland independent women filmmakers a few years ago and got to know the festival, the organization fairly well, and been following their work and collaborating with them. So when, about 1924, when the independent film festivals in China, including a few women film festivals, were closed down and, suspended due to very stringent censorship and so on. And this one has become the only kind of remaining major platform for women filmmakers in the region to share their works and continue the work. And Huang Yushan, she has a whole chapter in my book, chapter 2. She was one of the founders of this festival. And the picture on the right, when she was young, she just had returned from doing MA in my department, cinema studies. I didn't know until much later. So she was alone in a way. And she was, classmate, was only about same time and collaborated. See, Anli became very well known, and she went home to do all this groundwork, making films, teaching, and building institutions. And no one knew about her. I didn't even know as a Chinese film scholar. So it was very, embarrassing for me. And then I had a rapid sort of make-up homework and invited her back to show film. So she is exemplary of the many women in my project. They're versatile. I'm not sticking to sort of the very authorist discourse in a very aesthetic, stylistic fashion. I look at their broader social profile. Filmmaking is just one of the things they do. And they have curators, critics, and writers. In her case, she's also a fiction writer, very accomplished too. And educator, dean, and nurtured many students, including Jasmine, who was her student. And you saw in the beginning, Huang Yushan was her executive producer. So a quick overview of the book layout. Now that I finished the manuscript a few months ago, waiting for the reports this week, next week. So I share, the little bit of the layout. And the pictures, I talk about pictures more maybe than words. Sylvia Chang, she deserves the first chapter as the godmother of the Taiwan new cinema. She was an actress, singer. She's more famous and popular in the region, including Southeast Asian, than probably some of the male authors, because her songs traveled before her screen stardom. She remains a very robust, strong figure in popular Chinese Mandarin music and cinema. And she was, a few years ago, the chairwoman of Golden Horse Film Festival, the most important Chinese language film festival in the world. And she made a very interesting series of films, crossing over romantic and family melodrama and art house realism. So the first part dedicating to 4 different filmmakers about their multifaceted endeavors in cinema and beyond. But cinematically, I find the kind of constant sort of searching for synthesis and re-energized genre possibilities between realism, melodrama, really interesting and important for the social causes they want to push for. So Huang Yushan already talked about, her films chronicle colonial Taiwan and post-colonial Taiwan in very innovative, interesting ways, especially in mixing documentary mode and melodrama. And the next 2 filmmakers, Yang Lina, Huang Ji, are mainland-based younger filmmakers born in the 70s and 80s. So it is also very intergenerational kind of account. You know, Sylvia Chang and Huang Yushan and Ai Xiaoming, which I mentioned too. They were born in the 50s, so they're like the mother's generation, if not grandmothers, and then we have the daughter's generation coming along, and they all know each other. They help each other one way or another. So it's also about creating some sort of network, formally and informally, among themselves and with other filmmakers and critics and so on, curators outside the region. So the chapter I shared with you is from this part, which look at more closely at sort of innovative approaches in the documentary field. So for me, melodrama and documentary are not genres. I take them to be broader umbrella terms, more like moods as you use in our field. So it encapsulates many sub-generic tendencies, and they, you know, this I find fascinating why women filmmakers are just not, you know, religious committed to one single genre, but actually crossing borders all the time and mixing these modes liberally and creatively. The first chapter is about Wen Hui in the picture, a dancer, choreographer, experimental filmmaker, artist, but also filmmaker. How she made a couple of sister kind of films, 2 films related to each other about her newfound relationship and family history around this lost third grandmother, not related by blood, and how this new bond, literally through the tying of their hair, re-energized her, lifting her out of personal trauma, depression, and along the way also rewriting modern Chinese history from ground up in a village in the courtyard of this grandmother who got kicked out of Wen Hui's. I mean, she divorced. She divorced the husband who was not good for her anymore, so left the Wen family and created her own new world, you know, on her own. But decades later, Wen Hui found her again and brought her back to family history as well as a broader cultural landscape. Then coming next is Jasmine Lee's film Money and Honey, situated within her larger body of work, which I talk more in detail. I think it's time I need to move on to that part of the talk. The last 2 chapters, if you're interested for your teaching or, you know, other references. Yao Jing is Hong Kong filmmaker, queer filmmaker and a scholar. She wrote one of the best books about a Hong Kong woman pioneer filmmaker, Tang Shuxuan, a forerunner of the Taiwan New Wave. So find her monograph. I talk about that in my intro quite a lot because that was the first good monograph about gendered authorship in Sinophone women's cinema. And her works spread. She also studied in New York New School, and she made experimental films in New York, in Japan, Macau, and very cosmopolitan diaspora. Currently, she's based in Taiwan, taking, I think, a refuge there for the time being. And last but not least, pushing more toward the radical feminist use of the documentary, of the video camera, digital era, featuring 2 very prominent activist filmmakers, Ai Xiaoming and Zhen Jinyan. And how they use cameras in different ways and interrelated ways in social movements in China, in very risk-taking activism on both personal and political levels. So the epilogue, as I said earlier, you know, try to look at the pandemic situation, for how it is sort of for good and for bad, and also the birth, the emergence of new generations of Chinese American and diasporic Sinophone filmmakers around the world. Yes, now it's time to, I think, go into the film per se, and I will skip these slides that are more kind of quotes from my introduction, some of the key terms, explaining Sinophone and cinefeminism, and in conversation with current transnational feminist discourses in film media studies and beyond, and introducing Trans-Asians method. So I will skip those. And how I came to define, sort of outline, Sinophone cinefeminist sphere, kind of using, conversing with my colleague Bob Stam's interesting idea of trans-artistic commons, transmedia commons. Because public sphere is such a broad term, loaded term. It doesn't work in China. We do not have a public sphere. So I look beyond for other terms, and also coining terms such as intimate public sphere, borrowing from Laurent Ballon. But I think the commons has more resonance. It has a lot of utilities in many senses of the word. Authorship, ownership, copyrights, distribution, and affective, emotional commons. It could be very abstract. It could also be very concrete. Sharing is probably the main term here. Communal and yes. Okay, now into the film we watched yesterday. And since most of you have watched, I also tried to abbreviate some close analysis discussions. I call it an epic documentary melodrama of migrant labor and love. So I think by now you sort of understand why use this rubric, this description, based on my interest in melodrama studies, especially revisionist melodrama studies, and my interest in documentary. So I'm sort of trying to highlight the sisterhood between the two modes, and how this synergy, transmedia and trans-artistic common is articulated in Jasmine Lee's work, and it is sort of most representative of her film work to date so far, which took 13 years to make. So this was the latest film in the Homeland Womanland series, 家国女性系列. And she thought she finished it by the time she, released Money and Honey. But now she's making another film, 10 years in the making, and the themes are very much homeland and womanhood. So I think it's a lifelong project. I'm sure, her next film probably will be along that line as well. So yes, but the main themes, are about a woman's place in family and society, and in relation to aging and the care for the elderly, and the migration diaspora being also her persistent concern. And probably just will read some of these quotes from my own chapter. So this project, which is really a durational and it's durational trans-Asian dimensions, and the film with an epic scale and quality, carried out through an affective and dialogical mode of co-creation. I think one of the questions was maybe Barbara, was about this allyship, co-creativity, right? It's not just very invasive, some sort of journalist, documentary, go into a very new, strange location, say, can I film you? Can I have the permission? No, she did not need that sort of formal permission. She gained sort of their heart permission by her being there from day one, because her grandparents were there. And she was caring for them. She actually gave up. She told me years later, she gave up going to do an MA, like Huang Yushan, her mentor in New York, to stay back in Taiwan to care for her grandparents. And she then enrolled in Huang Yushan's MA documentary program in Taiwan. So learning to make documentary while caring for her grandparents. So it became a dual parallel undertaking and education for her. call it using the Trans-Asian method. This is an exemplary, instance project as envisioned by some of these scholars. The film is passionately invested in transforming, which is about time. So the trans here is really more about transformation, not sort of the transnational flow, anything, but aimed for change. And also recognizing the internal differences and hierarchies within Asia itself, the decolonization, the imperialization within Asia, between Japan and its former colonies, between mainland China and its many peripheries, and in Taiwan, between the mainstream population, middle class, and its own South, the Southeast Asian workers, and so on, right? So I think it is very useful category, and not pitching Asia, against the West. Then it's just too simplistic kind of binary posturing. I think, in the first part of the paper, in a chapter, I talk quite a bit about its, relationship to the broader new Taiwanese documentary, which is a new wave in its own right, alongside those art house feature fiction films made by more famous directors. The 90s, when Taiwan was rapidly democratizing, opening up to the world, it also witnessed a robust documentary movement, and supported also by the government in part. So it's both independent from the ground up, but also supported by government policies, subsidies, and so on, to help produce and release on public television and theatrical releases. So this is a very different scenario than mainland China, where documentary had hardly any space in theatrical release, and if they were, shown on CCTV, and they will be, very proper and strictly following particular lines. The independent documentary in mainland China is, in a world in its own, and as I said earlier, it's being suppressed heavily. It doesn't have a common venue, the commons, to show and share their work anymore at this point. So this documentary new movement is very much invested in social justice and rewriting history and highlighting women's and indigenous voices. There are many of them. I'm using some of the films for my current seminar on documentary movements from mainland and Taiwan in comparison and in conversation. And they share their approaches in ethnographic fieldwork, oral history, and performativity, intersubjectivity, and last but not least, melodramatic sentimentalism. It's something very unique to many, especially the theatrically released feature-length documentaries that appeal to the larger audiences through this mode, through music. The melody is very important to melodrama, and this type of documentary uses music and songs and music more than other more straightforward ethnographic film or other indie films. Right, okay, I've talked about most of it. And touched on, in the section, touched on the problem of sentimentalism, how it is always being dismissed by New York Times, art house criticism, literature departments, and so on. But it has been undergoing revisions and restitution in the past couple of decades, in a historical turn to film historiography and literary studies and so on, and some other disciplines, how through sentimentalism, we can actually access and uncover a lot of buried national histories. And women in particular, like Lauren Brown in her work talks about, were targeted, by sentimental mass-produced literature, in her case, and cinema, starting from the early cinema, race drama, melodramas, and post-war American sort of modernization fabulations of sentimentality, but how along the way they also not just simply sort of targeted as consumers, but they also seized upon the affective possibilities of sentiments to forge their own communities, such as reading literature together, sharing their own stories, domestic abuse and depression, and so on and so forth. In short, it has been regenerated as a possible productive term, and if we use sort of that to talk about sentimentalism in Taiwan new documentary, I actually disagree with this Taiwanese male critics' view that, these films are navel-gazing and inward-looking. But I think like a film like Jasmine Lee's Money Honey, yes, it's very inward-looking. It's about domestic space, nursing home, these everyday, chores you do every day. Women do this every day. Some women do too, but not every day, all the time. But also they look out also a lot, and they participate in the larger world of politics and social change. So the sentimental quality of this looking inward, however, is inseparable from the constant looking outward to the city outside of the confined space of the nursing home, and they can see, the Tower 101 opened in 2004. So the tower was actually opened in the middle of the filmmaking. It was new, it was diegetic, it was not just simply a postcard background, right? So it became incorporated into the time of the narrative of the documentary. And the workers, they're confined. They do not have any rest day. They can hardly go out. They're like prisoners. They're like inmates, like the elders they care for. But they can access to this broader view. They have the luxury of the fifth floor view of this 101 and can imagine the world beyond. Right. Now, I briefly also compare the film with another film about migrant workers, also from the Philippines, but those were mostly queer female workers in the factories. And this very powerful film, I also recommend highly, I use in my course as well, is a more straightforward activist film. You see, protests, and about working conditions and so on. But interesting, along the way, the film also began to look inward. In the dormitory rooms, how these women filmmakers form sisterhood and solidarity and love relationships. And Feng Mei Haber is my new colleague in Asian Film Media Initiative. So she coined this term activist sentimentalism. I think is very apt in describing it. So I would say this film and Money and Honey could be a sister sort of set of films to teach and share with your classes. And she also talks about, how the aesthetics of this film engage morally and aesthetically legible modes and sentiments. And it was also a very influential film, helped to change the policies along with Jasmine Lee's film. Okay, I have said quite a bit about, how the film embodies this boundary form between documentary and melodrama. So I'm not going to belabor more, and these are quotes from the chapter. Maybe this is worth reading for those who have not read and have not seen the film. I say they are maternal. The film is very much about maternity, about motherhood. So it's in a way maternal melodrama that is different from the lesbian factories, in which mostly the characters were young people, without the family burden back home. So they're more free in a way, individually. Their maternal domestic labor is transferred into another kind of home, private nursing homes for the elderly in a foreign country. The transnational affective exchanges and the circuitous trajectories expose the porous borders of the home and the world, domestic life and national culture, giving rise to a documentary sentimentalism that not just looks inward and outward simultaneously, but also reflects on the interdependent relationships between the filmmaker and her subjects, Taiwan and its South. Jasmine is very aware of her privileged, position, in the process. She's educated, middle class Taiwan woman, and her grandparents were cared for by the, foreign care workers. But she formed a genuine relationship, affectionate feminist relationship with these workers. You can see yesterday she's wearing the dress that the baby made for her. So they have kept in touch. They are really like sisters. They probably will spend their, aging years together, somewhere, one way or another. So it has really. I usually do not like to use the word transcendence in my classes, but I think this film has achieved a certain quality of transcendence over time and space and spirit. And as I said earlier, Trans-Asian method is very much about transformation through time, over time, and the tears that the characters shed. And I have watched these films many times, and each time I cry. It just plugs your heart, yeah. And maybe because I'm also, a working mother, and have, as I mentioned in the beginning, I actually have worked in a nursing home a long time ago as a young immigrant elsewhere. So I really feel relatable in many ways. And one of the beautiful things about the film, the aesthetic strategies that she employs, is, as we talked about yesterday, this trans-artistic, transmedia discourse. Poetry, songs, and letter writing, and the visual track and photo videos, and very organically woven together. And these are not just any poems or any music, but they are from these very people, from their voices. And the musician she hired to compose the soundtrack and songs is from the Philippines. The musician was just there visiting Taiwan at one festival. I think a woman maker, yeah. So they had encountered, and Jasmine decided right away, you will be the one to give the melodies and voices to the film. And we have the characters reading their own letters, right? The voiceover takes a very important role, like in a lot of classical melodrama. But, a letter from unknown woman, we hardly see that woman, it's unknown. Here the woman unknown quantities, we come to not just know them, we come to love them. And yes, the field work started in 1998. When Jasmine first went, she went along with the owner of the nursing home. So it was a very different position, right? From the Taiwanese, middle class, they need a short, they have a shortage of labor. But over time, she went many times back in different roles. As an ethnographer, as a sister, as a family member. Toward the end, she simply became kind of like part of the larger kinship. And the baby is the protagonist. There's no mistake. She's just so charismatic and talented and compassionate. There's no way of not loving her. And losing her mother during the beginning of her second tour was just heartbreaking, and there's no chance for her to go back. And it was not pandemic, it was normal times. So these contracts very harsh on these workers. And not just in Taiwan, I also encountered Philippine domestic workers in middle class Hong Kong, some mainland households as nannies. They could not go home. They have their own babies at home. And they go along with, my friend, who hired her. And my friend is a housewife. Why do you need another housewife? It was just very disturbing. Okay, and they also used animation. So it's not just two modes, but three major cinematic modes, very creatively employed and mixed together. And Lolita is actually my favorite character. She underwent real transformation. She became a feminist. She had this consciousness-raising moment, and she began to see the world in different light. And she decided to stay home, not to go into this exploitative, contractual sort of relations, and working low-wage jobs, and supporting his family and teaching his younger children, grandchildren to love themselves and seek a path away from what is prescribed by the national export economy policy, right? So in the end, we got transmedial, intertextual, accented, and melodramatic discourse. But last but not least, I want to underscore the importance of faith, religion. Actually, this was one of the hard points for me as a secular and Buddhist person to understand. Jasmine as a Christian feminist filmmaker, and in liberal American academic discourse, it is a very difficult topic to deal with. So I really had to face up to it, and then I really understood much more about her worldviews and how her religion worked in her case in doing this kind of work with the sisters of Catholic faith and other faith. We know care workers and migrant workers, also some of them of Islamic traditions and so on. So the importance of the sacred. The sacred is not just Jesus the God, but also a profound love of the family, of the country, of the land, that is also, endowed with sacred meanings over generations. And looking sideways to Indian cinema and Italian cinema in the revisionist melodrama, feminist informed, which I take part to, I feel sort of, informed and inspired to approach this film that has strong religious subtext. Okay, so, they reach certain kind of interfaith feminist sort of bonding here. Okay, this is the last slide, coming to the homecoming part. So the film ends and updated a few years later. But the most beautiful part about the film is its afterlives. So not only the film was made on these road trips, intra-archipelago, road movies, many journeys back and forth, but also how the protagonists, many of them, showed up in the exhibition of the film many times over around the island. So it became a road show of Money and Honey, involving Oni and Lolita's sister. You saw at the end of the film. They came to talk to the audiences live. Baby and Lolita, returned to the island to participate in the Golden Horse Film Festival, and they dressed up like princesses and walked down the red carpet. I will have these pictures in the book when it's published, but here are a couple of them. So they came back at the invitation of Jasmine and the festival, and they met countless audiences, and some were actually family members of the elders they cared for. So it became a reunion, on a much larger scale. And care work institutions, owners, policymakers, lawmakers, activists, they all watched the film. So it became a national festival, of this film. And it really put a lot of energy and persuasion into social change and the lawmaking. So afterwards, those contractual conditions improved significantly. And how these care workers would have a more rest time, home visit, and higher pay, and such and such. So here's the end, and I've spoken more than planned, but I didn't use only 45 minutes. Okay, that was okay. All right. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing the talk back, your own research projects and audience, if any. I do not see them on Zoom. They're somewhere in the universe. But thank you so much. My job today.
Thank you so much, Zhang, for a very wonderful and rich talk, which is very theoretically informed as well as enjoyable. I think our audience and panelists may have a lot of questions to ask, but I would like to solicit the questions later because we want to move forward and carry out the second part of the panel discussion. And then we will do the Q&A at the very end. How about that? So here I would like to invite our panelists to the front. Oh, okay. No problem.
The speakers here. Just like I did. Speakers here, audience there, so we can all see.
So basically, I just want to throw out some questions. I just want to probably invite you to introduce your work, your research background, your sustainable interest in the subject matters and fields you have explored in the past. So it would be great. In particular, it would be great if you could address and relate your work to our Song initiative. I probably know that, if I interpret correctly, the agenda for the songs is to create a forum, this kind of a dialogue for people to explore the terms of sustainability. So if you could relate this. Okay, so ready to go. So who's going first? Okay.
We all know what we're doing.
Okay.
So you can just use your arrow keys to navigate.
Okay, perfect.
Here are your slides. Okay.
Oh, let me just bring my computer. So just a few sentences. Just for the, just in case I need. So
Okay, great.
thank you so much. I will really first start by big thanks to Will for inviting me, for Ying Shao for including me, for Barbara probably for recommending me, and then for Zhang for all of this, for this wonderful talk, and really for the introduction of the film to all of us last night. So my name is Ada Hosic. I teach in political science department, and my work focuses on feminist political economy on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I have actually dabbled and worked a lot, or focused my work on the arts, on cinema, on the political economy of Hollywood, and so my reflections today will be in part a representation of that combined work. And I'm in the process at the moment of revising a paper on filmmakers from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and where kind of women and feminist filmmakers who have become incredibly prominent after the war. And the paradox that paper tries to address is that while these feminist filmmakers are really prominent and kind of winning awards and making the story and the narrative of Bosnia and the war known to international audiences, and actually kind of their films also circulate domestically, they are not in any way our traditional national narratives. And so there's a question, I think, which those films have posed for me, is why do feminist narratives differ from these traditional national narratives that had been presented in the previous kind of Yugoslav national cinema? And then the second question is how and where do they travel and where do they find their audiences? And I was thinking that maybe not having seen the film and knowing very little about Asia and Asian cinema, except for what I learned from my brilliant students, that maybe I could find some connections between these different themes for this very brief presentation. So let me just first start with something that actually is kind of the topic of my feminist political economy this very afternoon. And where we have talked a lot about what makes, again, feminist political economy different from political economy in general. And one of the key concepts for feminists has always been the one of social reproduction. That unlike political economy, which focuses on relations of production for the most part, the women's work was rendered invisible by industrial capitalism. Women have been kept at home. And their work was mostly focused on child rearing, homekeeping, maintaining the households, and really reproducing or producing workers for the economy. So there's a lot of kind of that work in feminist political economy that then depends on a set of dichotomies, okay, between domestic spaces and spaces of work, between the public and the private, and on some level between domestic and international. It is assumed that household is actually just exclusively domestic. The last few decades have obviously rattled many of these dichotomies and transformed the world in which women work. And economies of care, which is what Money and Honey as a film focuses on, some authors argue are very distinct from this work of social reproduction. They're not really just about child caring and child rearing or production of workers. They're about caring for those who are unable to care for themselves, and very often those are the elderly in the rich parts of the world. And that work, these economies of care now, transcend these previous dichotomies. Okay, they're not domestic; they're taking place in the public, in a public spaces of work. But the work that they're engaged in is effective, emotional, very similar to that child rearing that women once upon a time used to do at home. It's also, as we saw in the film, it's profoundly transnational. Most of the workers who are engaged in care industries in the rich countries of the North are coming from somewhere in the global South. So this is the chart here is actually about how immigrants are indispensable to the workforce in the United States in the healthcare center. But what I also wanted to show is is the gendered nature of this chart itself, where workers such as nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides are women, but highly skilled professionals such as physicians and surgeons are men. So the kind of the gender dimension of this work is embedded even in kind of the advertising or understanding of it in the more progressive parts of the U.S. kind of in the U.S. discourse. And then household, as I mentioned before, is also being profoundly transformed through these processes of, once again, I'm not enamored with globalization as a concept, but with these transformations that have taken place nationally and across borders in the world economy. So if once upon a time domesticity was associated with women and with this invisible and unpaid labor, households themselves are now transnational. Okay, and once again we saw that in the film that the households are broken up. The households are rejoined. For a number of workers, even high-skilled workers who are working in the West, they continue to care for their parents who may be located elsewhere. They are therefore hiring other transnational workers to fill in their spaces. A number of these kind of flows are now registered in remittances, and a large number of particularly low-income countries are highly dependent on that export of labor, and the households are dependent on the remittances income for their sustainability. And Philippines is a really kind of fascinating case because, as we heard in the film, it's been strategically exporting labor, particularly female labor, since the 1970s. So it's a kind of female labor is state industry in the Philippines. And it's not the only country in the world. One of the countries that obviously we're all talking about lately is Ukraine. Ukraine is highly dependent on that female export of female labor. Its entire transition since the 1990s has been dependent on export of women for various different services, including human trafficking, that kind of attracted a lot of attention for a while in Europe. But nearly 72% of Ukrainian immigrants in Italy are Ukrainian women who are working exclusively in kind of house care, domestic work, as domestic laborers and domestic help, and in care homes. So this is an enormous industry, state regulated and state sanctioned, and it has become much more visible in media and cinematic representations. And so Barbara's book was very helpful to me when I was planning my feminist political economy course, because it's really through these representations of women on film you can realize how much that political economy landscape of women being stuck in households and only engaged in social reproductive labor where they're waiting to get wages for the invisible work has now changed. We can find women now in multiple positions, in different spaces, in different roles, and many of them in European cinema are women who are engaged in care industries as well. I happen to be also a fan of, and I've talked with Barbara a lot about this, I'm a fan of kind of crime and detective dramas, and it's also very interesting how much of that representation of women in mysteries, crime, TV series is actually about women victims of trans-border transactions, whether it's human trafficking or they're victims of warfare, and they end up being re-victimized in new spaces. But then also there's another trend of kind of women who make it and break it are then very often kind of represented as bad mothers. So a number of detective shows is really always playing on that kind of, on the bad mother's role. A greater number of women who are represented in cinema is also kind of a result can also be found in the cinema, in the film industry itself. And this is what Zhang was talking about. We now both notice more women where we didn't see them before, but also more women are entering into film industry. Since 2016, the Swedish kind of filmmakers and the kind of the film board have been insisting on this 50-50 kind of platform to include more, to fund more women filmmakers through national boards and also through European links, and that has transferred to Australia, New Zealand, I think, in part to Hollywood, though much less so, and also to have them more represented at film festivals, because that was, exactly as Zhang was saying, that was one of the great bottlenecks before. Women filmmakers just couldn't have their films screened. So that is changing. We see more women, they're producing more films, we see them as screenwriters, as directors, as producers, they're engaged in every level of the film industry. And to some degree, as Will also reminded me, the shifting kind of distribution networks, the fact that you could before circulate DVDs and sometimes bootlegged and legal kind of VHSs, but now through streaming services, there are more openings that are created, I think, for women who are entering the industry. And the co-productions also, women tend to be quite nimble in finding sources, also working with much smaller budgets, and that has kind of lowered the barriers to entry. That, I think, is creating this potential that we can see more feminist narratives on the film. And what I mean by more feminist narratives, it doesn't mean that every woman filmmaker is producing a feminist narrative, but that some of these feminist narratives are now really very different than what we used to see in quote-unquote national cinema, a problematic concept for decades already in cinema studies. And one of the sentences, I'll just read you what I think, is that kind of state-centered narratives used to affirm male heroism, recognize women's motherhood and victimhood. They celebrated sacrifice of life for the collective body of the state. That was kind of the usual stories. Feminist narratives, on the other hand, are messy, contradictory. They're very often incoherent. They highlight gendered entanglements of power relations, and they make room for silences when they address violence. They expose existential vulnerabilities and ontological insecurities rather than producing solace and closure. In short, unless they're explicitly subsumed to some kind of a national project, feminist narratives speak with many voices and run transversally across instead of parallel to the international state system. But that then poses this problem. How in the system, which is currently, I think, in a kind of a victim, if you wish, or producer of even greater kind of ethno-nationalist convulsions than in the previous decades, how can these voices find their audiences? In that sense, Money and Honey is an incredibly optimistic story, where somehow that film managed to find the proper, appropriate domestic audience and kind of really resonate in public policy programs in Taiwan. In the cases of these Balkan filmmakers that I'm looking at, very often these films end up being very highly rewarded and awarded by the international audiences, but they don't in any way shape or affect domestic politics. And so for me, that kind of remains the big question. I'm done.
I hate to say this.
No, I'm done. I'm done. Yeah.
So that we
Yeah.
can stay on track. So could every panelist limit your presentation
Yeah.
to 7 to 8 minutes so that we can finish
Yeah.
the event on
Anyway.
time? Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm Barbara Mena, and since you did ask us to say something about how we fit in, I did write a book about women and work in European cinema, and it has 2 chapters on migration in cinema, and one focus is on sound, and argues that sound connects the migrating women to the past and the homeland in film, and the other one focuses on the gesture of care, arguing that one of the problems is that in a Taylorist model of labor, every task is clearly identifiable as a part of a labor process, but the gesture of care work is not. So if I put the hand on the forehead of the child, we cannot recognize whether it's love or labor, and therefore the migrant who lives in the home and takes care is already always suspicious. But I wanted to do today is give a very quick sort of visual vocabulary of those kinds of films in relationship to the film Yesterday. And I'm starting with Ulrich Seidel's 2007 Import-Export, which of course goes with Aida's topic of women's care work that ends with migration really being an import-export product between certain countries. And as you might see from this little still here, it is an art film, but the film itself became very controversial because it also has that documentary, it relies on documentary realism in the sense that the women themselves are actually migrating women, and there was one scene of particular humiliation, and so the question was, does the film then reproduce that kind of humiliation? But what this film does, and a lot of films that address the question of migratory labor of women, is also focus on that continuity of care work and sex work, where care work appears as love and sex work appears as desire. And so in both cases, it makes labor invisible. But what was interesting me about the film Yesterday was, of course, this realism about the old people, which, you know, if you were there the entire film, I think at the beginning gives you this real sense of being uncomfortable and thinking about our own aging. And as we move through the story and we see the women being sort of so affectionate with them, we also sort of grow affectionate. And so actually I did want to show Seidel's portrayal of the old people also as a contrast, and where the kind of art film mode comes in. Another film that is quite similar to the film we saw yesterday is an Italian film by Mario Rizzi called Chicken Soup. It's similar in that it does take place also among these different Asian countries. It's very clearly documentary. It was shown at the Taipei Biennale. It's much more haunting, even though they're talking heads, because this is a film that I think advances that argument of the continuity between the kind of sexual exploitation and domestic labor. So there's the women go both to, get married or work in the home. And so the argument or the difference to the film Yesterday's, as sort of horrific the reality of the film Yesterday was, that there was still some kind of institutional protection, whereas the argument that this film makes, which of course a lot of these kinds of also social science studies make, is that once the women are in a house, they're not regulated in the home, and it's actually much more dangerous. And so one of the most haunting scene in the film is a woman talking about basically being raped and then losing the baby, but she was a woman who took care of the child and the grandparents and the home, and so she talks about sort of this rush that she had to live through every day. But another theme that comes in through this film very much, and that was in the film Yesterday, maybe a little bit repressed, is the kind of resentment by the children who forget how their mothers look like, and that get resentful and actually in the end blame them for going away and becoming sort of commercial, that their relationship ends up being commercial. And I thought that was interesting yesterday, when she brought these gifts and the kids are talking about the gifts, and that sort of ends up being their relationship. Another film that's very similar to Yesterday, and I'm sorry, in the transfer of the PowerPoint, the title got lost. It's called Promise on Unrest. It's from 2010. It's an Irish film, and it is about Filipino workers who do work also with the elderly who have Alzheimer's. And it's also a film that goes back between the Philippines and Ireland. But it's from 2010, and so the kind of virtual conversation and exchange between mothers and children becomes more important. So the phone and the computer becomes more important, and it becomes sort of the collapse of time and space, in that they're always in contact with that other place where they're not. And so it's much more focused on that kind of affective relationship with the homeland that's permanent in a kind of virtual way that we didn't have yesterday, or that was very pronounced to me, who knows these kinds of films and social realities, at the beginning yesterday when we see the character writing the letter. Similar to what you said about the kind of advocacy or activist film, those women in this film then become politically active, and they articulate the politics that surrounds migration themselves. And so I will say that that's something that I kind of wished for yesterday, that in a certain way that the politics would have been made more explicit, but that might also be a kind of question of taste. So having given you this very brief, very quick sort of rundown of the kind of conventions that are associated with this global explosion of films about maids, and you can think about the Netflix series Maid, of course, too. I did want to, before I go there, mention one more film that's called The Women on the Sixth Floor, and that's a French comedy. But the interesting thing, of course, is in The Women on the Sixth Floor, the women live on the sixth floor. Like yesterday in the film, the women lived on the fifth floor, and just sort of to point out that tradition of spatial sort of separation within a building or within a domestic sphere that functions to make that labor inherently invisible. But I did want to come to two examples that I think do something differently, and I do think it has to do with that question of how to integrate that realism and that melodrama. And one is Anne Hui's film, A Simple Life, and I will say that when I originally saw it, it was also too sentimental for me. But looking back at it yesterday, from the film Yesterday, I actually came to appreciate it as a kind of attempt of thinking through how could sort of a rehabilitation or return of that labor, how could that look like? And it's an interesting story of a male filmmaker who went abroad, who became famous, and then returns and takes care of the family maid who's in an old people's home. It takes place in Hong Kong, but the images of the old people's home are very similar to yesterday's film. And also, as you see here, these are two moments where he takes her outside. So that importance, you know, of going outside, but also for us as spectators, of having this moment of seeing something more than these kinds of walls. And it's interesting too, because I mean, I have seen several films now from around the world about maids, and actually several in the Horn, which was interesting yesterday. And one of the filmmakers, one from Panama, said, you know, one of the things that happened is that a lot of people in, let's say, Latin America, Central America, grew up with maids in the home and never thought about it. And it's actually going abroad, studying in the United States, that then when they came back home, suddenly they saw the situation differently. And that is part of a reason why there are so many films from Panama, Argentina, Brazil now who think about the maid as a topic. But my last example is actually from Singapore, and this is a Singaporean installation, new media, experimental artist whose topic actually is film. He also lives in Berlin, and he made a video installation that reworks, of course, the play of the title, Imitation of Life, Life of Imitation, and there's like 3 different actors of the kind of different minority groups in Singapore who play the roles of the very famous Imitation of Life, the maternal melodrama, but also cross-dress. So there are 3 men cross-dressing as women, sort of restaging the scene. And if you don't know it, it is really, I would say, the ur-text of the maternal melodrama, right? So on the left, you see the maid, you know, massaging the feet of the, you know, upper class star. On the, you're right. It is that key scene that Ming Wong redid, where the maid confronts her daughter who's passing, and so the melodrama is, of course, the sacrifice of the mother. Interestingly, about this film is Susan Kohner, who plays the daughter, was actually the daughter of a Mexican woman, mother, and a German Jewish immigrant who became a producer in the US. So, and of course, Detlef Sierck originally was Detlef Sierck. So there's this whole kind of subtext, actually, of transnational migration, where I always argue that it's actually Douglas Sirk who projects sort of the history of migration onto the woman. You know, the woman's body, the racialized body, then becomes sort of, has to act out this melodrama of maternal sacrifice that's not recognized by anybody, and that then actually produces the tears. And there I am at the end with sort of the main tropes, but as you can tell, of course, we could talk much more about everything.
I'm going to wait just a second.
Okay.
But if you want to stand by.
I'll stand by.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody, Ying, Zhao especially, for inviting me to be here today. And I wondered exactly what I might have to contribute. My first impulse was basically to talk about a film that was very close to Money and Honey, that in my mind, it was Lix and Fawn's Last Train Home, but I wasn't sure that everybody had seen that film. But one of the things that struck me in the theme of what everybody has been talking about is that a few years ago, a number of things came together for me in my professional development. The first was that I'd begun working in China a great deal, and in fact have made 8 trips to China in the last 9 years, and lectured widely in China, and have completed a film there called The Curse of the Terracotta Warriors, which my Chinese colleagues said would never be able to be aired in China because the word curse is not a good word. And so I asked them, I said, well, what do you think we should call the film? And they said, how about the blessing? The blessing of the terracotta warriors. Made me sick at my stomach. Anyway, so I finished that film, but something inside me for a long time, I thought, you know, I've made many films, and these films have aired nationally on PBS and done very well in, you know, distribution. But I had never made a film in which the central character was a woman. And this really began to bother me because I thought, you know, all my life, women have played a very, very important role, not just in my family, but my teachers were very strong women, and my colleagues, very strong women. Even filmmakers that I knew, like the German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, whom I corresponded with for years and met several times. But I had never made a film. And so while I was in China, somebody said to me, he said, well, you know, have you ever thought about looking at a society in which women dominate, women rule, women make the major decisions, because there are not that many in the world, but one is in China. It's called the Mosuo. And so I started researching the Mosuo, and it turned out that the person who had written the definitive book on that, C.K. Shia, was a faculty member at the University of Florida. And so I thought, well, this is worth looking into. And so I made a trip to China, to Lake Lugu. Just getting there is just unbelievable. You know, it's Gainesville to Atlanta, Atlanta to the West Coast to Shanghai, Shanghai to Kunming, where a driver from the East Asia Institute for Visual Anthropology met me for a 9-hour drive through the mountains to Lake Lugu, at the foothills of the Himalayas. So on my trip there, I still felt like I didn't have the story. What is the story here of the Mosuo? Because actually, the Mosuo, it's been very commercialized, and so many people have made films, short films, long films about the Mosuo. But I wanted to show you just a short, give you a visual image of the place. And so I want to show this short film that Jason might help me with, unless I can just tap that on.
Well, I think you've already logged in the other browser.
I logged in on somewhere else, so let's do it there.
This one here.
Yeah. If you can just make it full screen, you got it.
Ready
You
to
got
go?
it. Okay, let's do it.
There we go.
Will that show up there? This is Lake Lugu. Well, that's just a an overview of sort of what Lake Lugu looks like. And you might wonder, well, what is so different about the Mosuo culture? Well, first of all, women really do. They own all of the property. The homes are owned by the women. They don't marry. The Mosuo don't marry. They engage in something called walking marriage, in which basically they're free to have as many partners as they want. For the wrong reasons, that attracts a number of tourists. But in reality, most are monogamous. So I ask about how does a male express an interest in a female, and how all these things take place. And so someone had told me, he said, well, a Mosuo woman might meet a Mosuo man at a dance, and if she makes eye contact in a certain way, or if she gives a kind of hand signal, then that is a way of expressing interest. And since the men and women don't live together, what she does is she leaves her door open in her home. And if the man is interested, then he climbs the wall and enters her home in the evening, but he has to be gone by dawn. So when I heard this story, and I was sort of fascinated by it, so I met this one young Mosuo man, and I asked him, I said, is that how you do it? He said, oh, hell no, we use cell phones. So the culture obviously was changing. And so I still felt like I didn't have a story. And then I met this woman by the name of Chu Wei Hong, who lives in Singapore, who wrote this book called The Kingdom of Women. And I thought, well, that's it. She was a high-powered attorney from offices in San Francisco, in London, in Singapore. And I thought, I would tell the story through her eyes. But then I thought, she went there 10, 15 years ago. She built a home there. But it's all happened. It's all in the past, and so it all has to be told, as something that happened previously. And I didn't really like that as well. And then there's a book, occurred to me, a book I read many years ago by Daniel Lerner called The Passing of Traditional Society. It's a terrific book. It was about modernization in the Middle East. But what had happened was the Mosuo had become contaminated. The Mosuo had become modernized. The Mosuo had been affected by Han culture. And so really, if you wanted to know the real Mosuo, it turns out you had to get away from Lake Lugu and go to a place called Yongning. And so that's where I'm working right now, is looking at that as the real Mosuo and looking at how that has transitioned from that previous culture into this new culture. And I'll show you these slides really quickly, and then I'm through. But I don't know where the slides are.
Yeah, I'm sorry for... Use the arrow keys on the keyboard. Yeah, I'm sorry to being interrupted.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I know, I'm the worst. So I just had a few slides to show, and that's filming in Lake Lugu. There we go. All right. Thank you all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Another of our panelists today was Welson Tremura, and we had a brief discussion yesterday after the filming, and he had some very nice thoughts about the role of music in the film that we saw last night, and how important it is. He's unable to be here in person, but we did some collaborating since last night, and he sent in some texts that he's been working on, and I'm not going to try to go into these here in detail, but he does connect. He actually sent me an email, and so All of the material of the PowerPoint will be available on the event website. If it's particular materials, for example, the images that Churchill wanted to show us, and etc., that these are things that we can revisit with more time. And that includes this longer text, the importance of song texts. You're seeing that? Yes. In the Brazilian folk tradition. You see that there's actually quite a few pages of this. And I just wanted to integrate these just kind of for the record, so to speak. And about these, in an email that Wilson wrote to me, he says, "My comments regarding Money and Honey are how cultures use songs and text to express there must be inner sentiments of joy, sadness, happiness, and ultimately faith. I mentioned 7 analytical topics that result from developing an in-culture understanding of how individuals under different types of life pressures react, sing, and find equilibrium in life. Concerning the Money and Honey, or Money and Honey, my comments most express how different cultures embody and transform their willpower to achieve a complete placement in life." So these are just brief remarks that he emailed me, but he wanted to have sort of a general context within which to place his remarks. I'll say just a few words. Clearly we're running a little bit longer, and I did want to leave maybe just a minute or two for any questions we might have. So the angle that I was going to take on my response was not really directly a response, not immediately directly a response to the film Money and Honey, or to Zhang, Dr. Zhang's work with this film and with Asian women film in general, although I have to say it's very much inspired by it. It's a shared vision, really, that I have, and you can see how it kind of spills over into songs, and songs sort of as a project spills over into it. But it's the vision of a global cultural public sphere, I myself come from German cultural studies, and so I start with one of the big texts for me in my professional sort of formation was Jürgen Habermas, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. And of course, this is a very different sort of context that's very distant from the topics generally that we've been looking at for the most part, but I think they're relevant. I think they're very important. Although we are in this Occidental sort of cultural context, as we move through early modern Europe and then beyond, we reach a point where we end up with this question, which I've put at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide as a question: a global cultural public domain as something to be sought after, as something that we need that does not yet exist, perhaps. If there had been more time, I would have gone over the ancient Greek public sphere. I would have touched a little bit upon the idea of the public sphere as it's developed in early modern Europe. Time does not permit me to do so. There were all kinds of problems with those. The main problem was men tended to be in the part where people actually met as free citizens in this space, in this public sphere. It was a very gendered thing. The oikos was the household. That was where women were. That was their business. Interestingly, the prefix interestingly, the forerunner of the prefix eco. Public, private in the modern period, it's a very different kind of animal structurally. We'd have to look at it and see just how different it is. But you find some interesting similarities there too. You have a division of public, private. Private is largely composed of the idea of the small family, German Kleinfamilie, and guess who's in charge of that? The women are in charge of that, and that has all kinds of repercussions. I mean, these are sort of cultural structures that we've seen, popping up in all of our talks in different ways. Just these kind of basic divisions that occur, certain kinds of health care provided, and how gendered everything is. And it would seem that this is something that's very deeply culturally embedded. And I'm talking about Occidental culture up to the point where I began talking about the vision of a global cultural public domain. And as vision, let me suggest dream, maybe vision, dream, perhaps utopia. This would involve basically a transformation of the internet as we know it. This is the project of an enterprise by Christian Fuchs and Klaus Unterberger in their Public Service Media and Public Service Internet Manifesto. And Chapter 5 of this is looking at things from the perspective of a 2040 perspective, by which time. So it's a kind of utopian perspective, but it's sort of challenging us to look at what might actually be accomplished by the year 2040. And there were a few things that caught my eye that reminded me of some of the things that we're talking about. So imagine 2040. In 2040, public service media will have remembered its future. It has adapted and transformed its public service mission to inform, educate, and to entertain according to an open and transparent digital citizenship, and renews its contract with society. In 2040, public service media is sustainably funded and will be based on a reformed license fee that is accepted by citizens. The public service internet's value for money is comprehensively documented, evaluated, publicly controlled, and transparent to the public. In 2040, public service media organizations are wealth creators for the creative sector that provide visibility to many artists, such as musicians and filmmakers. In 2040, public service media delivers and creates high-quality entertainment to reflect and represent the culture and diversity of everyday life. In 2040, public service media operates on the local, national, regional, and global level. It invests into quality journalism, including investigative journalism, innovative formats, new technologies with appealing user experience for different groups in the society. Young people see public service journalism as an attractive, viable environment of information, communication, collaboration, participation. So this brings me back. I wanted to try to make a connection. There's the vision of a global cultural public sphere, and I couldn't help but notice that vision is one of the two main components of the melodramatic imagination as it's defined by Peter Brook. I did want to kind of try to make that connection in the end to one of these themes that we've had, and so the thing that occurs to me in the end is this ambition, this desire on the part of Baby in the film to have a house. And there are these different scenes in which they're talking with each other, and at one point she just says, "What do you want to do? What do you want to earn money for?" It would be nice to have a house, and somehow that house seems like such. In the scheme of things, it seems like it should be such a doable thing in the scheme of things. I mean, the resources exist for such a thing to happen. I mean, it seems really marvelous. It seems like it should be something very somehow straightforward. But of course, it's in the actual scheme of things, it is very difficult, and it's connected with striving, with dreaming, with a life that's difficult and ongoing, and tied into forces over which sometimes she has control, sometimes she doesn't have as much control. So in the case of Baby, she wants the house. It seems like it's possible to actually accomplish this, but yet it seems in some sense to be a dream. It seems to be disproportionate. There's a kind of disproportionateness to it that might be or might come across as melodramatic, and so I just wanted to suggest that the actual tools for making a global cultural public sphere, perhaps along the lines of what Fuchs and Unterberger are suggesting, that this is also just as Baby's house. I mean, the instruments are available. It just seems like somehow we have to make the compelling case for actually doing this thing, which is a possible thing to do. However much of a dream it might appear to be, it's not. It doesn't have to be a dream. This actually can be something true. This actually can be something that we should be trying to realize. So I did that much faster than I wanted to try to do that. And I realize it is quite distant, but I did want to try to connect up with the film at the end. But that was, I think that concludes the respondent part of this.
Yeah, we have gone a little bit over time, so do you still want to do Q&A or?
If we have any
Maybe
Q&A.
2 questions? No. Do we have any questions? Or you can.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
I'm sort of thinking based on a comment. Sorry, my name is Jake Shen. I teach in the history department. I wasn't able to see the full film yesterday, so I am mostly relying on Dr. Zhang's descriptions of it in her paper. I just wanted to, I guess, build on a comment that Ada made, where she kind of reminded us of the kind of the idea of social reproduction in the political funding, and I wanted to use that to kind of think about the conceptual architecture of the paper and how it's being framed within the new work. And I was sort of struck by the language of the filmmaker yesterday, and I guess the subject of the film, and also the framing of the paper, of the reappearance of the language of sisterhood, right? The ideology of family, the ideology of family and nation, this jiaguo idea. So these like metaphors of family and like the institution actually of the family sort of come together, and the way they come together in this sort of era of neoliberalism being articulated around the family and not the individual. And so I'm just curious kind of how we should make sense, I guess, of these claims by the filmmaker and also by the individuals within the film, as well as, I guess, Dr. Zhang, and the way that you're framing the paper about this kind of, the claims of sisterhood, the reinscription of this kind of family, especially given your concern about this, the way, or I guess the fear that the state is going to co-opt this liberal discourse in the way that it is sort of playing on this politics of sentimentality or sentimentalism. So that's sort of, I don't know if that question kind of makes sense, but it was just something that struck me that seemed to come up over and over, and it was something that I was curious to hear if anyone had any thoughts about.
Oh.
The other thing I wanted to follow up on was kind of what you started there. This was a very difficult film for me to watch because my father died in 2019. In the last year of his life, he had to be in memory care. So we saw firsthand, the family saw what has to be done to care for someone at that state of their life. And it is heart-wrenching. It was very, very difficult for us. So the film was hard to watch for me. But one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about this film and following on this comment here is this definition of sisterhood and family. Of course, I do not come from a Confucian or a Chinese or Asian background. And so I started thinking about our relationship, the way in which I oriented to the caregivers at my father's place as opposed to the way in which these women interacted with the people in this place in Taiwan, you know, the care center in Taiwan. And so one of the questions that really struck me was this definition of family and how that plays into this notion in Asian cultures. I've begun to get very interested in Asian cultures and family structures and whatnot, because for our family, we never viewed the caregivers as extended family. They were always, and that's part of our Western mindset, they were always viewed as the employees. Now, we were incredibly grateful for the employees, but we never made that leap to their family. There's something else there. Seems to be another dimension that we miss, or that I would miss as a Western viewer of this.
Thank you. Actually, I have another question different from that, but I just want to say something about like the definition of sisterhood, or like, let's say, the employee, if you treat the care, like people take care of your elders. Like my grandpa, he died last year at age 96. But my grandma, he died 12 years ago. And after she died, my father talked to my grandpa, said, I give you two paths. One is find a nanny for you. The other is you marry the nanny. You gave her all your money. We don't take care of you. Your children, we don't have capability, or we don't have time. But you give the money to the nanny. Your nanny become your wife, and then she can take care of you. Actually, this is really common in mainland China, I think, nowadays. It's like there's no clear division, I think, between like an employee or extended family, and everyone knows that, like the little bit like elder people, they marry for that reason. It's actually similar, even like nowadays, like a normal age. Common age marriage is similar though, but it is something different. But anyway, I have some other question here, but it's like it's something about censorship, I guess. Because it was really interesting when I heard Dr. Jose talking about like the nowadays, like the streaming, how it can lower the barrier of like newer, like especially female filmmakers to come to join the film industry. I was like, but I have a friend. She graduated in Beijing Film Academy, but she actually is a major in advertisement director. But when she was in Beijing Film Academy, every year they need to make a annual report or something, like they need to make films. But at the time, they need to hire people. But they only probably have less than 20 students in 1 year, and they help each other. But actually, every time, only male students, and have personal connections with the film industry. For example, she said her cohort, one of her cohort, his family is close tied to Zhang Yimou. So every time he wanted to shoot a study project, everyone will help him. But everyone else, they don't have resources. I even helped my friend to make a lot of small films. I was in her films like every time. It was like a shoot in my family. It was like, it's really funny though. But it means like, anyway, on the one hand, for the education, it's really gendered and prequel, and really this barrier is not breakable. It's like, to me, at least in mainland China. But now it's like for the streaming and for the distribution, the variety of distribution definitely has a chance. But to me, I don't know, do you see any optimistic, or at least what is your general thought about the censorship in mainland China or whatever in other places? How this can change like the film industry in terms of the female filmmakers in the future? Thank you.
Back to me. You.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for the wonderful sharing of your work and perspectives. I learned a tremendous amount of things just within this short amount of time. And for the additional comments and questions, they go into different directions. I think I go backwards. I think, the structural patriarchal, totem pole in mainland China is stronger than ever. I think the Xi regime's sort of paradoxically, her sort of the whole idea of restoring the original mission ethos of socialism and communism has paradoxically undermined a lot of the previous achievements of socialist gender economy and policies because it's compounded by unabashed neoliberal capitalism. So these two go together, actually not separate. In the near future, it's very hard to see bright prospects for Chinese women. And Yang Lina, whom I talked about in chapter 3, she, had to shift her strategies to go mainstream for her fiction films in order to reach the proper domestic audiences. You don't want to just make your films no one sees, only the foreign curators and a few critics. So her compromise is to get her scripts censored, both by the censor bureaus, but also by capital, by her producers, who just want to capitalize on melodrama. So melodrama is, as Barbara, film scholars know, it's inherently contradictory. Imitation Life, this Douglas Sirk, this British German director came into Hollywood and anatomizes the American middle-class bourgeois family. But in some ways, the genre, its own expressive possibilities, so-called excess, now it's being actually contended. The excess actually is the normal. Exposes, but also in sometimes normalizes those family structures. It becomes a kind of bodily techniques for the audiences to take on and reproduce in everyday life. So it is a conservative genre mode, and it's sort of revolutionary critical potential has been mined by through deconstructive aesthetic tactics such as Sirk's excessive red color, mise-en-scène and such. So to employ such a sentimental, melodramatic approach does take certain risks. But the payoff is reaching the popular audiences to speak to the everyday level of discourses and not just the elite, the highbrow, and so on. So there is a contradiction there, and that's why I compare Jasmine's approach, as she said yesterday too, hers is the personal political, maybe the personal is more pronounced than the political. And the activist potential of the film takes place in its affective registers, how it changes people's mind and feelings, and then ripples through into the policy sectors and such. It's probably undeniable. It creates a certain sense of reconciliation, and especially this film has a happy ending, more or less, different from some of the films that Barbara mentioned. It's feeling good, it legitimizes certain existing ad hoc social arrangements that do not topple, revolutionize, the regime, the status quo, but make certain incremental changes, like in particular people's lives. And then, unexpectedly, it did change a lot of people's lives. So I think neoliberalism, like a melodrama, is a mixed bag. I mean, at this moment, we're living in it, and it has unleashed a lot of, it's a Pandora's box, has unleashed a lot of the worms, but also allowed us to see some dead ends and some possible paths, the visions, the dreams you might have, the new relationships you could build. But I also appreciate this professor's comments, because he was kind of addressing your question too, that neoliberalism, just like globalization, these are two abstract terms. They work differently, resonate differently across the globe, the South and the North, within Asia or outside Asia. So as leftists, academics and so on, we always, have our dead horse to beat, capitalism, neoliberalism. But I think it is much more important to get to its infrastructures, its lived experiences, rather say, oh, this is a bad guy, and then, using it will just undermine all kinds of subversive or critical engagements. Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm addressing the sources of your question, but I feel that's what a medium like cinema, a documentary mode that tries to engage both the personal and the political could break some grounds in thinking outside of certain boxes, abstract categories and such. Okay.
Thank you. Indeed, they are very cathartic films that also driving the social changes. So, Will, do you have a final remark you want to make, or?
I just would like to thank everybody who has been involved. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Ying. Thank you, Zhen. Thank you very much for coming from NYU. Thank you all for coming today. I know it's a busy sort of strange day before a holiday weekend, but we still had, I think, a nice turnout and a very nice discussion. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.